Baldwin, Dr. Sullivan, and Dr. Glass are scholars who are doing the work of intersectional praxis. Today's webinar, Intersectionality Here and Now, highlights how we are thinking with intersectionality in the here and the now, while also considering where intersectionality has been and where it can go. Intersectionality, I think, may be one of the most widely used yet misunderstood concepts. Kimberlé Crenshaw first laid out a theory of intersectionality in 1989 in the paper, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. Published in the University of Chicago Legal Forum, the essay describes the interconnections of structural racism and sexism in Black women's experiences and demonstrates the failure of any single axis framework to account for those experiences. In Crenshaw's words, intersectionality is an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. Within 15 years, Crenshaw's intersectionality traveled outside of law and feminist and ethnic studies, proliferating across fields and genres. Yet as powerful as Crenshaw's writings are, by the early 2000s, intersectionality was often used as a placeholder term, devoid of deep engagement, sometimes even lacking citation of Crenshaw or any of the Black feminist and queer women of color writings that influence intersectionality. By the 2010s, intersectionality became part of a polemical cultural landscape in the US, sparking the intersectionality wars. Whether described as dangerous identity politics, included on a list of banned concepts, or as a necessary analytic of activism, intersectionality has erupted into viral disputes and memes. The here and now of intersectionality is, as Crenshaw notes, urgent. This webinar was planned amidst this urgent context and with a commitment to recognize the presence of intersectionality in queer, Black, Indigenous, and women of color feminisms. From the 1977 Combahee River Collective Statement describing the specificity of interconnected oppressions to the writings of, for example, Audre Lorde and Lee Maracle, and the impactful 1981 anthology, This Bridge Called My Back, edited by Cherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa. As Jackie M. Alexander reminds us, any reclaiming of the past to the present cannot simply be linear. We consider where we have been in order to be present, truly present for the here and now, that are also always about futures. So this is the first time the panelists and I have been in discussion together, so you all are truly going to witness this live. We will start with each panelist individually addressing the question, what is intersectionality to you? And then shift to about a 30-minute group conversation, and then we'll take attendee questions. You can submit questions on the Q&A tab. Kilo Zamora, Faculty in Gender Studies and Intersectionality Collective co-facilitator, will be helping with the Q&A. Thank you very much, Kilo. And before beginning, we just need to do a special shout out to Estella Hernandez, Transform Assistant Dean, who organized all of the infrastructure for this webinar. Thank you so very much, Estella. We could not do this without you. And I also want to acknowledge and thank our live transcription interpreters and our sign language interpreters with us today. Okay, so let's begin with our first question. What is intersectionality to you? And we're going to go in the following order: Andrea, Mecca, and then Christy.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Wanda. Thank you for Transform for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. I'm truly grateful for this opportunity. And so to your question, what does intersectionality mean to me? I think about this question, and I think it is important for me to state that the legacy of intersectionality, as you rightly mentioned, as a concept, there's these preceding tenets before its coining by Professor Crenshaw, such that when I think about what intersectionality means to me and how I, as a Black woman, a Caribbean immigrant from a working poor family, am deeply indebted to this history. And yet I'm also not neatly implicated in it, at least in the ways that folks in the US often tell it. And this is important. And so what this means for me is that I think about the importance of Black women and other women of color, including from the Caribbean and from the Third World Women's Alliance, who are all integral to intersectionality's conceptual development and activist roots very, very early on. And I'm thinking, for example, acknowledging scholars in the US, myself included, because I'm here, who trace the concept as far back as Maria Stewart in 1830, or Anna Julia Cooper's 1892's publication, A Voice from the South, or Harriet Jacobs' 1860s narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman, which is to say that Black women in the US have been theorizing about intersectionality conceptually for a long, long time, whether calling it double jeopardy, as with Frances Beale, and a number of other terms, including interlocking oppressions or simultaneity, for example, long before the term itself was coined. However, in terms of my own reflections about the historical legacies of intersectionality and what it means to me, I think about how Nina Leke calls what she calls the nodal points along the theoretical trajectory of intersectionality, and how these hold a personal connection to me and my own feminist praxis and being. And I'm particularly conscious of the epistemological and practical inflections and reflections of women who, like me, are immigrant women and who come from immigrant families and are writing and expressing vividly how white supremacy, anti-Black racism, patriarchy, classism, heterosexism, and also nativism impacts us, and finding connections across all types of difference while also respecting difference, right? And so while I'm thinking about the legacy of intersectionality through the theoretical interventions of folks I have mentioned previously, and also folks like Angela Davis and the Columbia River Collective that you mentioned, Wanda, Pat Hill Collins, for example, I'm also, very important to me also are works from Audre Lorde and Shirley Chisholm, Gloria Anzaldúa, Maria Lugones, and Jackie Alexander, who you mentioned, but also Caribbean feminists like Eudine Barreto and Kamala Kempadu and Carol Boyce Davies and Denise Ferreira de Silva and Ronaldo Walcott and others who really provide the context in which intersectionality becomes a concept that has wider geographical resonances, whose work allows the concept to travel and to influence and be influenced by feminists from the Caribbean and feminists globally who are doing their own and similar theorizing, such that there is what I might venture to say a creolization of the concept that applies to my full experience, right? And so when I'm writing up my dissertation in 2012, using the term that Kimberlé Crenshaw coined, I was writing about intersectionality in the context where it has to be in conversation with Eudine Barreto's Caribbean Gender Systems. It has to be in conversation with Edward Kamal Brathwaite's work on interculturation and acculturation, and the works from, for instance, Rhoda Reddock and Pat Mohammed and Andaye and many more Caribbean feminist theorists. So I guess what I'm saying here is that I came to intersectionality through the works of these Caribbean feminists, such that intersectionality for me is about a deeper and a more expansive collaboration and understanding of my own feminist self and my own communities. All of these things, whether in all of my positionalities, whether in the Caribbean or in the US or elsewhere. And really, intersectionality for me is about this requirement and this deeper commitment to transnationality in my own scholarship, and a commitment to transnational feminist connections. And so I'll stop there.
So I'll just jump in. First of all, I'll echo Andrea in offering thanks to Wanda, to Kilo, to Estela, and also I want to thank Andrea and Christy as co-panelists, and of course the interpreters. Very excited to be here. I'm excited about this conversation. And I already want to just kind of like jump in and start chit-chatting, but I also think for me, it's important, I would like to kind of ground my exploration of this question, what is intersectionality to you, in the work of Audre Lorde for a lot of the reasons, in fact, that both Wanda and Andrea have just mentioned. So I'm gonna start with a quote from Audre Lorde's biomythography, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, which comes out in 1982. Mm-hmm. Being women together was not enough. We were different. Being gay girls together was not enough. We were different. Being Black together was not enough. We were different. Being Black women together was not enough. We were different. Being Black dykes together was not enough. We were different. It was a while before we came to realize that our place was the very house of difference. So as Wanda said, right, coined in 1989 by legal studies scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw to describe specific simultaneous impacts of racism and sexism on Black women's legal, civic, socio-political experiences in the US, the term intersectionality has been taken up in academic, activist, and cultural discourses as a signifier of multiple difference. In these conversations, the intersection has served as a way of naming the simultaneous, concurrent, and mutually imbricating functions of several power structures, including racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, homophobia, cissexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, and Eurocentrism, as well as the sociopolitical locations of subjects and communities that are impacted by multiple forms of oppression. Yet, as Andrea has pointed out, right, the history of intersectionality begins long before the term's coining. So I really appreciate the invocation of writers like Anna Julia Cooper, Lorde, in fact, right, even sort of before this moment of intersectionality's coining in '89, Harriet Jacobs. Black women writers have been narrating, speaking, and singing from the intersection since long before 1989. The works of writers like Lorde, June Jordan, Pat Parker, Ntozake Shange, Gwendolyn Brooks, Bessie Head, and many others have long theorized what the Combahee River Collective in their 1977 statement calls the, quote, interlocking vectors of oppression, end quote, that shape Black women's experiences of difference, illuminate the larger workings of power, and shape the conditions of possibility for our radical visions of freedom. So following these writers then, I see intersectionality as a way of describing Black women's multiple relationships to difference and power, and using those languages to explore the complex imbrications of power at large. And I say it's a way of describing difference and power precisely because the writers that I'm most kind of animated by are really invested in in highlighting and revealing the crucial place of linguistic and artistic expression in intersectionality theorizing. For Lorde, standard legible languages of identity are, quote, not enough to describe the locations of her difference, right? And we get that in the repetition of that passage that I read. So in 1982, she invents the biomythography as a new language. Literally, the subtitle is A New Spelling of My Name. It's a new language for naming her multiple subjectivities, a textual location that can, quote, house representations and interrogations of her place within social power structures. And so the genre of the biomythography, for those who haven't read it, and I encourage you to do so post-haste, like run out and read it now, is rooted in memoir or autobiography, but it incorporates aspects of fiction, poetry, lists, song lyrics, myth, and mythology, and several other textual forms in order to tell her story of Black lesbian becoming, in which differences of not only race, gender, class, and sexuality, but also disability, reproductive status, immigration status, health status, fatness, and many others are a crucial part. We can also think about Ntozake Shange's 1975 Chorea poem for colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow was enough, right? Where Shange sort of uses invents the genre of the Chorea poem to meld stage forms, dramatic forms, poetry forms, musical forms, dance forms, and several others to talk about Black women's experiences of sexual assault, sexual autonomy, and desire. So For me, in my work, especially in the Poetics of Difference, queer feminist forms in the African diaspora, I'm thinking about how these sort of new invented genres that I read as sort of linguistic rearticulations of intersectionality, how they connect with, subtler and perhaps, differently nuanced expressive forms and kind of destabilizations of form and genre in Black and Afro-diasporic feminist and queer cultural practice at large, right? So in other words, those writers who are not sort of naming and inventing new genres like the biomythography or the Korea poem, but who are using intersectionality as a guiding principle in their creative praxis, and who ask readers, viewers, listeners to do the same as an interpretive strategy, right? What happens when we center intersectionality as we're engaging language in any aspect of our cultural experience? And so here I'm thinking about Black feminist forms of experimentalism by Canadian Trinbagonian poet Dion Brand, Norbese Phillip, South African lesbian photographers Nele Maholi, queer Afro-Cuban hip-hop group Kudes Kubensi, and American rapper Missy Elliott, all of whom invite readers into an intersectional reading strategy, asking us to participate in multiple forms of difference, and in fact, to navigate multiple forms of difference in the formal properties of their texts. Reading these writers for their intersectional engagements reveals that intersectionality is, among other things, a language, and that's what it is for me. I see intersectionality as not only a metaphorical spatial location, right, the intersection of race and gender, for example, but also as an artistic tool and a reading strategy. It offers what I call in the Poetics of Difference, it offers what I call in my writing a poetics of difference, an approach to creating, arranging, and interpreting expressions of both difference and power that allow us to examine the overlaps and simultaneities, right, that often get lost in normative modes of expression. These poetics and interpretive tools ask us to touch difference in new ways, enacting forms of radical creative visioning that can express experiences of multiplicity, complexity, and simultaneity in ways that normative English prose cannot reach.
Well, thank you so much, Mecca and Andrea, and thank you, Wanda, for facilitating this conversation, and thanks to Kilo and Estella and our interpreters and captioners for making this event accessible. I'm humbled and honored to be part of this conversation. And before we began, we were talking about how hungry we all are to be in conversation about important things, and this feels really important. So for me, intersectionality is a critical lens for understanding how power works. Patricia Hill Collins says that intersectionality requires an attentiveness to power relations and social inequalities in their relationship. So it's a lens through which we can understand how race, nativity, disability, gender, class, and sexuality are reciprocally constructing phenomenon. And for me, it takes as the starting point the questions about who is left in the margins, who is rendered invisible, and what does this rendering reveal about how power works. Jennifer Nash writes that to think intersectionally is to consider how gender is made through race, class, and sexuality, and vice versa, and to theorize how gender is inhabited, lived, and negotiated in particular, distinctive, and varied ways. Now, I just want to echo the incredible complexity of the history of this concept. And I want to be sensitive to Jennifer Nash's caution about trying to distill the complex genealogies of intersectional thought into a single story, which I think happens often. But I do think it's really vital to note that intersectionality was born out of social movements and activism. Kimberlé Crenshaw writes that intersectionality was a lived reality before it was a term. And so intersectional knowledge and intersectionality as an analytic framework is rooted in the lived experience, right? It emerged out of a community of Black women activists across history, including many queer Black women, thinking deeply about their lives and their social location and the systems and structures that shape their lives. And through the sense making, building community and organizing for liberation. And for me, this history is important because out of this history come some of the most significant qualities of intersectional thought, right? The theory of power that centers knowledge garnered through lived experience. And the praxis that emerges from that's centered on movement building and radical social transformation. So the history for me reveals some of those most important constitutive elements of intersectional thought. And as a social scientist who studies organizations, I joke that, my work, I'm trying to make organizations sexy again. I wish me luck in that effort. But this as an analytic framework, intersectionality informs my work in important ways because it requires complexity and nuance when approaching questions about inequality and power. So Patricia Hill Collins argues that an intersectional analysis requires us to, approach the world in at least two levels, right? The biography, the personal lived experience, and the experience of confronting institutions that render oppression or privilege. And so to account for this complexity, right, is both an incredible challenge, but also I think the power and the urgency of intersectional thought. And for me, one of the things that's really influenced my thinking about the world at these two levels is the metaphors that Kimberlé Crenshaw used in kind of bringing this concept into the academy, and it was the metaphors of the intersection and the basement, right? Because both of these metaphors, the intersection and the basement, require us to hold these multiple scales at once. The institutional arrangement of power and the lived experience within the institution or within institutions. For me, these metaphors are vital because they reveal the complexity of intersectional thinking. And in particular, the example that Crenshaw used in her early work of Emma de Graffenried, who's one of the plaintiffs in a legal case that she selected to illustrate the concept of intersectionality. And what Crenshaw did with the story of Emma de Graffenried, right, is to track the ways in which the experience of the interlocking experiences of Blackness and womanhood rendered Emma de Graffenried invisible within the legal frameworks. And so by starting with the biography of Emma de Graffenried, the lived experience, Crenshaw was able to reveal the failure of the systems. First, her exclusion within the workplace, and second, the ways in which the legal system rendered that exclusion invisible. And this informs my own work on workplace justice in a lot of ways. I study organizations as key sites of power, and for me, organizations are critical sites where cultural, economic, and political systems are translated in ways that reproduce hierarchies of status, race, and gender. I study the ways in which Audre Lorde's concept of the mythical norm of the ideal worker is produced and reproduced through formal policies and informal practices in the workplace. So through my work, I try to make visible or legible how unearned racial, class, and gender privileges come to be viewed as natural, as skill or talent. And then on the other side, right, the embodied labor that outsiders have to perform to negotiate identity and belonging in the face of everyday mundane forms of racial and gender violence. So for me, an intersectional lens provides this vital insight and language for understanding and describing why and how systems support and ease the progression of some bodies and not others. I'll stop there.
Okay, I want to take the class that has all of the readings, right, and music references, because maybe that's a piece of what I know I would get so frustrated sitting on dissertations or master's theses, even just like 15 years ago, and people would just drop the term intersectionality. Maybe Crenshaw would be cited. Sometimes Crenshaw would even be cited. But what I'm hearing here is that how we're coming into intersectionality really matters, right? And if someone's introduction or knowledge about intersectionality is 2 essays by Crenshaw, we're all saying you're missing a whole depth, right? That is necessary, right? In order to really understand and put to work even the type of intersectionality that Crenshaw, right, was defining. So I want this syllabus, I want this class. When I've taught intersectionality, I do, sometimes I start with a Crenshaw piece because that's what people are expecting, right? But then we go back, right, to earlier feminisms, most of which have been named already today. And sometimes students are like, well, why are we reading this work? The term intersectionality is never even mentioned. And it's for exactly the reasons that have been stated right here today. I think that maybe helps understand, or let me ask it this way. So if Crenshaw's work, some people say, well, Crenshaw was speaking to a legal structure context. So can it be extrapolated into other ways of doing analysis? I think we've already spoken to that, but I don't know if you have an initial response to that.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think this is why I really appreciate Christy, bringing us back to the story of Crenshaw's coining of that term, right? The story of Emma de Graffenried is a narrative account. And in fact, there's an interesting history of legal storytelling as sort of political praxis. So of course, for me as a literary scholar and as a fiction writer, right, I'm thinking, well, this really sort of, it gives us a direct route into thinking about the history of intersectionality as something that's actually already beyond legal studies, right? It happens to be that the term is coined in legal studies publications. And I would even go so far as to say that it might even be at least the fact of that particular publishing venue, right? Where this word starts to emerge in academic discourse that, might create a false sense of sort of direct origination, right? And I think, Crenshaw is of course very clear that she's actually sort of interpreting a story, a narrative account, part of a sort of history of legal storytelling that is also building on several other narrative expressions of lived experience, as we've all said. So I guess that's all to say. I think in some ways it's the institutional sort of aspect of our engagement, I think, that sometimes pretends or confuses the longer, sort of more complex histories, right? That it's not about taking a legal studies term and applying it elsewhere. It's just noticing that the term sort of originates, in legal studies in a way that's most legible to us, but actually it's got this whole longer lineage and a broader lineage and legacy as well.
Mm-hmm. And some of the other terms that we've talked about, sometimes intersectionality is picked up and talked about as interlocking oppressions, right? And that focus that I was hearing across each of you, this focus on lived realities, right? This is a theory and an analytic that is coming out of lived realities, is coming out of activism, is coming out of a desire for change, a need for change to occur. And I like also thinking about intersectionality as a way to read power and to read power arrangements. Sometimes I think what causes confusion when I'm, teaching a class on intersectionality or when working with students about how to use intersectionality, I guess that really becomes part of the issue is like, how do we do intersectionality in a way that's actually intersectional? Because sometimes it ends up being taught, or we even have, some figures out there we can use in our teaching that make intersectionality look like an additive model, right? I take, for example, disability plus gender plus race. So And I've even seen it quite often written about as more of an additive model versus an intersectional model. And I'm going to take us back to Audre Lorde. We're not going to get enough of Audre Lorde today, but in Audre Lorde's 1983 essay, There Is No Hierarchy of Oppression. And Lorde states that she cannot separate her identities of woman, Black, and lesbian, and that an attack on any of these identities is an attack on all of them. And then Lorde goes on to emphatically state, I cannot afford the luxury of fighting one form of oppression only. And when I teach this, right, this Audre Lorde essay, we're very moved by it, but then still left with the question of, but how? How do we do intersectionality in ways that don't create hierarchies of oppression or don't collapse into that additive model?
I'll jump in. I think one of the things that you know, like you, Wanda, in the labor of teaching, I come up against is reducing intersectionality to rather superficial identity claims, and you know, kind of the identity Olympics model. And in Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's recent book, How We Get Free, she traces the use of identity politics to the Combahee River Collective statement. She says, she writes that was the first use of this term. And the term grew out of recognition that these overlapping identities expose the members of the collective to unique forms of oppression, but also emerged out of recognition that their shared experience could serve as an entry point into activism. So for the Combahee River Collective, the identity politics was part of the articulation of analysis of power that sought to validate Black women's experience, and on the other hand, facilitate their engagement in radical political organizing. So inherent in the use of that term was an analysis of a systemic critiques of colonialism and imperialism and capitalism, right? So rather than narrowing the political vision to the individual and identity claims at the individual level, the term was recognition of the potential expansiveness of identity as a pathway to movement building. But I think that's often lost. And part of, I think, the work of ours is to explore why the political impulse of intersectionality is often de-emphasized, right? Why we often overlook the deep political and structural critique inherent in the analytic and move to more kind of superficial applications or understanding. I think that's part of you know, the hard work of doing intersectionality.
I would also like to respond by saying, I think that when we look at the how, I think that actually the answer to the how, I believe, is actually already happening, right? So when we read Lorde's essay and then we put the essay in conversation with works of contemporary social justice activists who have been influenced by intersectionality, and the activists works that are using to frame this new kind of vision of this social justice movements, it is evident that the folks, particularly the activists on the ground, are engaging with intersectionality, not simply as an analytical framework, but also a praxis, right? And so like Christy said, at the core of intersectionality is an analysis and a critique of power structures. But what I think that these more contemporary activists are doing is that they're saying that while there are multiple power structures that produce differences, and hence we have like oppression based on gender and race and all of these other categories, they're also saying that at the core of these structures is a settler colonial system that is inherently anti-Black, patriarchal, and global. So if we start from this very basic premise that there's this settler colonial system that produces all of these other structures, we can see how we are all, despite our differences, implicated in a system and impacted in this structure. So when we remember that Audre Lorde also wrote in 84, that in a society where the good is defined in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need, there must always be some group of people who, through systematized oppression, can be made to feel surplus and to occupy the place of the dehumanized inferior. And so many of us, despite our differences and the differential power relations between and among us, are still very much part of and make up this surplus dehumanized group, even though our oppression might hit us differently, right? And it goes back to the work of, for instance, Sylvia Wynter, who would refer to us as all belonging to this archipelago of human otherness, right? And so because for me, intersectionality is preoccupied not only with identifying social problems, but also with strategies for social movements that respond to the embodied and the discursive and the hegemonic and the socio-political violence of white supremacy, its dynamism and its analytical frame and its praxis enables us to articulate and critique how multiple systems of power are enacted upon us, subordinating us as subjects who have these very different, but also very complex experiences and narratives while developing these intervention strategies that are evident in many social justice movements today. So I'll give you an example. When we look at, for instance, Charlene Carruthers' work, when she's writing about a Black queer feminist act from the perspective of a Black queer feminist activist, she writes that if our liberation movements has people on the sidelines or absent altogether, then it is not really liberatory. And this brief statement alone demonstrates for me how movements need to, that activists and folks who are really doing intersectional work, they recognize that although we have these differences, that they have to be non-hierarchical. So if we are to achieve some semblance of social justice, we need to make sure that we're not leaving anybody on the sidelines. And at the end of the day, we're all screwed by this system, right? And so when Kimberlé Crenshaw also explains that Black women, in that same article in 1989, that Black women can experience discrimination in ways that are both similar to and different from white women and Black men, this is what she's talking about. This is exactly what she's talking about. And to a failure to recognize these similarities, but also a failure to recognize these differences is a missed opportunity. And so going back, I know Wanda said we're going to keep talking about Lorde, but going back to Lorde, because Lorde says this, she says, a failure to recognize our differences is a failure to reach beyond the first patriarchal lesson. We cannot, like the power structure tries to do, divide and conquer, but rather she says we need to define and empower. And this is this is the language that intersectionality allows us to do. It allows us to define and empower. And I'll say one more thing. When I think about this whole differences and hierarchical differences, I always have to go back to how I, as a person who is from the so-called global South, is thought about through the Western lens, right? And so when I think about capitalism and I think about colonialism and white supremacy and how it produces conditions that are global, such that we're all in our varying areas oppressed, I'm thinking, for example, of the killing of Black people by the US state. Not only by the US state, but by vigilantes, right? And I'm thinking about the hashtag Black Lives Matter. But I'm also thinking how this is connected to the whipping of Haitian folks at the US southern border. And I'm thinking about the experience of Caribbean women regarding sexual assault and the regional movement called hashtag Life in Leggings. And I'm thinking how that is linked to Me Too. These are very different people, right? And I'm thinking how these two things are also linked to my experience and the hashtag Black in the Ivory, right? And while these are all very different groups of people, all experience very, similar and different oppressions in very specific and particular ways, I'm thinking how our social justice movements and our liberation movements cannot allow us to sideline any one of these folks. We're all, in our difference, in our similarities, necessary. We cannot get to a system of a point of liberation if we pedestalize one movement over the other. And I'll stop there because I know I've said a lot.
No, let's keep it going. Go, Mecca.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of jump in. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I love that we're all Audre Lorde stands in this space. This is great. I feel like, I'm among my people. But yeah, I mean, I really appreciate, Andrea, your emphasis on the concept of intersectionality as practice, right? And it makes me think of the Combahee River Collective, in their statement, right? The notion of an integrated analysis and practice. And that's in their definition of Black feminism. They see Black feminism as an integrated analysis and practice. And like you, Wanda, students, of course, are always sort of curious, well, how do we do intersectionality? How do we talk about intersectionality in a way that is sort of usable, practicable, right? And so I always find myself, for myself and leading them back to that notion, integrated analysis and practice. We are constantly always doing and thinking about what we're doing what we're thinking about, right? And the notion that practice as a kind of processual imperative, that we have to continue to do this work, even when it feels really difficult and we don't know how to do it. So in some ways, and I think this is echoing what both Christy and Andrea have said, to even continuing to ask the question, how do we keep talking about these differences as they seem to be proliferating, as there seem to be more and more differences to talk about, more and more languages for power structures to name? But I think for me too, this is where a focus on storytelling, literature, and creative expression is very helpful. Because of course, if you're looking at the story of a person, you're never going to sort of assume that first they're going to deal with their race and then they're going to deal with their gender, right? I mean, it's intuitive if we're talking about actual lived experience of humans to try and find ways to understand the kind of mutuality and simultaneity of these various forces that shape a life. As a creative writer, this is, in some ways, it's sort of like a strong character. Part of what compels us about strong characters is that very complexity, right? That we read into their multiple ways of navigating all of the dynamics that are impacting and shaping the circumstances in which they find themselves. And I say that to say I recognize that on certain levels, the recourse to the poetic and to the narrative, and it sort of feels abstract in some ways, and it feels perhaps maybe separate from or adjacent to what we might think of as a theoretical or political praxis. But then, as folks have said, Lorde and others remind us, that is a colonial logic, right? And it's a gendered logic, the logic wherein poetry is a luxury, right? Wherein poetry is something, superfluous and inaccessible and unnecessary, right? We have to sort of question, that logic and, thinking about sort of how we understand knowledge, power, and value, in ways that can lead us back to the theoretical and political movement and action of some of these creative texts and of language more broadly. And the last thing I'll say about that is, so for me, Lorde is also really interesting here too, right? The question of sort of how do we talk about specific differences and talk about difference more broadly at the same time in ways that are effective. In addition to all of her literary works, and of course, for me, the biomythography is one way of doing that. But also, if we kind of move through Lorde's, oeuvre and her discussion of herself in interviews, and all of the different ways in which she describes her own difference and her own identity. And I'll just read a few. So in Zami, as a child, she says that she's grown up fat, Black, nearly blind, and ambidextrous in a West Indian household. Then in the essay, Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, she identifies herself as a 49-year-old Black lesbian, feminist, socialist, mother of two, including one boy, and member of an interracial couple. And we can think of many other sort of catalogs of identity that Lorde offers us. Black lesbian feminist, warrior poet, Black lesbian poet, cancer survivor, right? That for Lorde, in these catalogs of identity, she's not only naming all of these specific differences and specific sort of locations within power, but also calling attention to difference itself, right? That to get any one part of this difference that she's laying out for us, we have to understand that it's multiple, that it's changing, and it changes multiple times over the long arc of her career. And I see that as a kind of instantiation of the integrated analysis and practice that the Combahee River Collective is asking us to take up, right? Sort of the work of that kind of thinking. And for me, when I talk with students about this, I always say, it might seem abstract again, but we can all think of a poem we read or a video we watched or, a song we heard that made us feel something, that made us think something, that made us do something different in the world. And I think that's a really helpful way of understanding the kind of power of intersectional creative and linguistic expression. That, this new way, a different way of thinking, a different way of speaking is also deeply political and has a lot to offer us in terms of envisioning the liberatory futures that we've been talking about.
I really like the turn that our conversation took from what does intersectionality do? And it became more about what does intersectionality require us to do? So, and I think that's such a key point, a key shift, right? If we're talking about talking to other people about intersectionality or how I'm incorporating it in my own life or where I want to get pedagogically, right, within a classroom. So this focus on, well, what is it that intersectionality actually requires me to do? And I thank you for taking us back, Mecca, to that integrative analysis, right? I think that's so key. And I sometimes too with students at first when they're just coming to this awareness, it's like, well, part of what it requires me to do is to pay attention, right? And to be present in a whole nother kind of way. And this could be paying attention also, to a poem, to a narrative, to an interaction, to the kinds of structures of power and discourse, right, that I'm seeing around me. But maybe that's a way to get into and think about intersectionality is for us all to ask, what does it require us to do? What kinds of practices, does it then yield? I want to ask, and we can keep on with that question and that focus for a bit more too. But I also want to address, what does intersectionality do to whiteness? And what does intersectionality require of whiteness? Because this has been part of, right, the cultural, very polemical debate that's occurring still with the United States. But it's also a question that gets asked in all forms of activism, and it gets asked within our courses too. So let's take a few minutes and respond to that. What does intersectionality do to whiteness? And what does intersectionality require of whiteness?
I'm happy to start, Wanda, and this question about what does it require of us. I think first, as scholars and teachers, right, we have to ask hard questions. Mari Matsuda says that we have to ask the other question, right? When we're looking at sexist discourse, we have to ask how, where, and with what consequence race or racism or able-bodiedness or heteronormativity are layered in. And I think to the question of what to do with whiteness, Sarah Ahmed refers to the concept of the labor of insistence, right? The labor required to gain insight into what is real, but also the labor of withdrawing our consent and complicity from a racialized gender system, from white supremacy. And I think part of what that requires of us is at least two things, interrogate our institutions, universities, the places where we do the labor of intersectionality, are sites that reproduce power, privilege, and prestige and white supremacy, right? So, but these are also the sites where deep intersectional thinking and community building is possible. So we have to kind of dwell in that contradiction that our institutions are complicit in reproducing a racialized gender system, and these are sites where we can actually engage in this work. I think one of the most important things, going back to Andrea's point that she made earlier, one of the most important things I think that intersectionality requires of us is to organize, is to build and organize. I was socialized into academia through a union that was deeply integrated in a community, a coalition of unions and community organizations. And I find myself thinking more and more about that as a model, because that experience taught me the importance of community and solidarity for advancing shared values in a powerful institution. And so I wonder, I have more questions than answers, but I wonder how we can organize, right? How we can do the work of movement building within our institutions and in partnership with others in our community, because I see organizing as a potential for creating space to study alternative models, right? Audre Lorde writes that we have to collectively examine the ways in which our world can be truly different. And I feel like we're all in such a moment of triage, this kind of constant crisis mode, that actually having space and time and kind of mental capacity to ask the kinds of questions we need to be asking, right? Space to explore the alternatives. What are the models that give us hope and sustenance? What are the characteristics of an academy, an economy, a democracy that doesn't leave Black women and queer folks and disabled folks behind, right? Space to discuss tactics. Who are our allies? Who are our potential allies? How can we strategically frame our vision in ways that resonate with powerful gatekeepers? How can we neutralize opposition? And of course, the work of organizing depends on building spaces where this work becomes possible. So spaces where the doing of intersectionality and where our thinking and doing can grow and evolve in new ways. Sarah Ahmed writes that a movement is also a shelter. So I think, for me, going back to Andrea's point about praxis, right? How can we organize? What are those opportunities? What are the characteristics of those spaces that can nourish this kind of work theoretically, but also very, very practically?
Nice. Andrea or Mecca, do you have anything you want to add?
I can, unless, do you want to go for it, Andrea? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And Christy, what you're saying, it makes me think about, again, for me, part of the development of these kinds of collective, collaborative political praxis, right? This organizing, it also requires a reach beyond the forms of knowledge that we value, right? Or that we are trained and taught to value, for me. And so, it makes me think about, I think for me, one of the things that intersectionality asks of all of us is to kind of critique our understandings and our valuations of both knowledge and power. As I've said, whose knowledges are valuable and viable. Once we sort of destabilize the primacy of academic knowledge, for example, or academic kind of circuits of knowledge, then suddenly we've got access to these broader, not only stories of power and difference, but also critiques, right, of power and difference. And we've got, access to stories of, collaborative histories of organizing, stories of sort of activist work, right, that perhaps don't register as such within the languages that the academy offers us or has offered us up until this point. And so for me, that then also speaks to the importance of, sort of engaging poetics in a different way, engaging poetics as something that is about lived experience within the, on the page, the stage, what have you, but also in our sort of broader experiences with culture. And that brings me to this notion of kind of the reading practice, right? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what a Black queer feminist reading practice does for us. I do think it can, in fact, be a kind of a building block for a collective, collaborative theorizing, if not organizing, right? Like the kind of the ideating, right? The kind of dream work that has to happen before, the kind of more legibly political movement building can happen. And that is something that I see happening in a lot of the forms we've talked about. You know, Ansalua's Borderlands, right, is another example for me where, you know, she calls it an autohistoria, right? Which is kind of translates maybe to autobiography, except it's more like auto history, right? What does that mean to Ansalua? What does it mean for her as a Chicana lesbian writer to speak to and for a broader history in multiple languages? Right? That's an example of a text that literally requires intellectual labor of us, right? If we are, so she's writing in multiple forms of both English and Spanish. If we are only English language speakers, then we have to either do the work, right? Perform the labor of figuring out what is being said to the nearest, you know, possibility, or sit with the relative powerlessness of not knowing, right? Suddenly it shifts the locus of power, and we as readers, you know, sort of trying to engage the meaning of the text, either have to be, you know, challenge ourselves to do that labor, or again, feel the relative powerlessness of unknowing. And I guess that is in some ways a way to think about the second part of the question, sort of, what does intersectionality ask of whiteness or require of whiteness? I want to think of it as, what does it do to whiteness? And I feel like what it does is it destabilizes it, right? I think it says whiteness is actually not the center of this conversation. And it requires, you know, of those who identify with or depend on whiteness in whatever way, it requires them possibly to do various forms of work, right? And perform various kinds of labor. And for me, very importantly, to feel, at least sort of briefly within the encounter with the text or with the moment, to feel the relative powerlessness of not being at the center. And then to sort of do with that feeling and with that learning what they will. And so for me, these are all really important interventions that have to happen in order for the movement, you know, the kind of more legible movement work to take place.
Yes, yes, and more yes. So I kind of inverted the question, and I started with, what does intersectionality do to whiteness? And I wrote down, intersectionality makes whiteness lose its damn mind. That's what I wrote down. And I mean, I'm constantly going back to settler colonialism and coloniality and decoloniality, because for me, intersectionality it has this global resonances for me as a Caribbean woman. And so when I think about how coloniality has said, or has formed us into, when we think about Black and brown people and women and queer folks and fat folks and folks with disabilities, how coloniality has signaled us and brought us into being as non-persons and as non-human. If what we've been saying for the last hour is that intersectionality is forcing us and calling us to critique and analyze this structure and these structures that are built in a colonialist system, then what intersectionality is doing to whiteness is causing whiteness to question itself, like Mecca said, to decenter itself, right? And white people are losing their mind. That is, I mean, when you think about all the pushback right now in terms of how intersectionality has made whiteness so uncomfortable, that we are hearing things like intersectionality is a legal theory that has been applied. The same question that was asked earlier. As a lawyer, I'm saying that law does not occur in a vacuum, right? And so when we think about how whiteness has become very downright combative and dishonest when it engages, when we think about Nash, that's what Nash is saying in the academy. Intersectionality is being used to oppress people who've been oppressed in the academy. And so that is what intersectionality, I think, in the ways that we use it correctly, and we use it in the ways that it is, and not co-opt it, that is what it is doing, right? And so what does it ask of us? What does intersectionality require us to do? It obviously requires to continue to directly challenge mainstream hegemonic dominant theories of knowledge, language, power, and politics, right? But for me personally, it also requires me, and I think us, to think beyond intersectionality and to think in decolonial ways, especially as the concept itself has been co-opted and used against those who are oppressed. And doing this also requires that we be reflexive. And to be reflexive, we need to be honest. And by honest, because what is happening is that there's a lot of dishonesty happening right now around our theorizing and our doing. And by honest, I mean that we need to also interrogate the ways in which our individual and collective agency is bound up in a process and a system of colonialization. That is, how are we, even as we talk about liberation, social justice, and intersectionality, how are we complicit in the processes and the systems that we are fighting against? And so what I'm saying here is not that we need to engage in any type of narrative that blames oppressed people for their oppression, but rather that we need to consider how, for instance, Saidiya Hartman is theorizing about a type of consenting agency that is happening when we engage with these systems, and how being honest and open about discussing and addressing these can help us to get to a deeper place of consideration. And so what does it require of me? What does it require of us? But I'm thinking more personally, what does it require of me? And for example, when I think about my situation, I think about how do I personally reflect on how I, as a Black woman, assistant professor, who is currently going through the tenure process, might hesitate to speak up about an issue that is unethical and unfair for other Black women who experience the university in similar and different ways. For example, Black women who experience the university as contingent faculty or graduate students at Virginia Tech right now, graduate students are currently fighting and being refused a living wage, right? And how am I, if I'm using intersectionality, if I'm saying intersectionality requires something from me, how do I also be honest in what I'm thinking in terms of, if I speak up, does that have a chance of jeopardizing my getting tenure? And how might I be complicit because I've convinced myself that I need to get tenure to be able to speak later, right? And this is just one example of my own personal question of what does an intersectional approach, praxis require of me? And I'm not saying that this is currently what is happening in my life, but these are just questions that I think are very important questions that we need to be honest every single time we're in a situation, particularly ones that require us to be in solidarity.
Yes. I'm just thinking, what a first webinar conversation to kick off our 3-year collective around what is intersectionality and what it's requiring of us. And there's been a theme coming up since we started this conversation. And I want to ask about and turn us to, what is intersectionality's relationship with then, we've mentioned settler colonialism, coloniality, but what is intersectionality's relationship with decolonialism? Are we all saying that this is part of what, if we are doing intersectionality, we're actually simpatico with decolonialism? Is that what we're saying here? Because, we've had quite a wealth of works published, I think, particularly over the past 10 or 15 years, that have been looking at the nation state, settler colonialism, but looking at it really through Indigenous, Pacific Islander, and Black diaspora lenses, right? Really exciting new work. And certainly our earlier works, Audre Lorde included, on Indigenous feminisms, were always talking about the state, right? And always talking about colonialism. We're not going to get to any of this, what can intersectionality do, unless we are attending, to settler colonialism and the power dynamics of that. So what are we saying about intersectionality and decolonialism? What is the relationship?
Well, I'll go for it. I think, yes, I think intersectionality absolutely is anti-colonial and decolonial. Particularly given the kind of histories that you're charting, right? Again, if we're thinking about intersectionality as sort of one language, one iteration for a long-standing discussion of the multiple relationships between power and difference, particularly as they impact race and gendered subjects, let's say, right? Then I think absolutely it has been, you know, it's been transnational, it's been anti-colonial, decolonial. I mean, even in the kind of collaborative history we've charted together today, right? Like, if we are thinking about intersectionality as a term, you know, as a language that has a kind of etymology extending from, for example, Harriet Jacobs, well, that's a transnational conversation then, right? Because we're talking about transnational migrations through the American slave trade, right? So, you know, that if we're sort of tracing these histories as fully and complexly as we can, then I would argue that absolutely it's always been, you know, anti-colonial, decolonial, it's always been thinking about the nation. I would say it's also always been sort of interrogating the fixity of genders, right? I mean, you know, it's also always been thinking about ability and disability, right? And various forms of mobility, age, all of these things, I think have always been part of, you know, what we are now for the moment terming intersectional analysis. And it brings me back to, Andrea, your last point, which I really appreciated, that like, you know, intersectionality has to also sort of theorize a move beyond itself, right? That like what happens when the language of intersectionality doesn't serve us because it's been sort of misconstrued and misread, right? And weaponized maybe. And I think that that's, you know, if we go in that direction, I think it's also important to recognize that this is one language in a long history of languages that in fact, you know, perhaps the word doesn't, because language changes meaning, perhaps the meaning of the word isn't as legible, you know, in the ways that we would want it to be, but that the concept has been there, right? And will continue to grow. This is also, you know, for me, the Combahee River Collective, they talk about a constant self-reflection that we need to kind of take up as Black feminists or folks who are committed to a Black feminist praxis, right? That we're constantly thinking about our multiple relationships to power. You know, June Jordan talks about this, especially in the context of labor and transnational engagement in her essay Report from the Bahamas, right? What does it mean to sort of think about my own relationships to power, the ways in which I might be a quote monster in the experiences of another person who is like and unlike me in perhaps another part of the world. All to say, I think that yes, this has absolutely been, you know, sort of transnational concerns and critiques of the state have always been part of intersectional analysis. Whether we're calling it intersectional analysis or not, the concept has always been there.
I would just add, for me, this goes back to the points Andrea made in her opening comments, right? Like, how can we be expansive in our intellectual and practical linkages? And you know, Jennifer Nash writes about this, right? The possibilities and opportunities for linking intersectionality more intimately with transnationalism, and I would add critical indigenous and decolonial thought, including, as Andrea said at the beginning, the work of Caribbean feminists and other non-Western feminists. Nash asked, like, what if we embrace a vision of intersectionality that is capacious enough to center women of color generally, and that insists on the intimacies between transnationalism and intersectionality in terms of their construction, use in academia and in movement building, and how might this engender generative feminist connections that, you know, allow our understanding of intersectionality to grow and expand and change in unpredictable ways. But I think to do that requires the centering of Indigenous, Black, and anti-colonial knowledge and critiques, that reflexiveness that both Mecca and Andrea have talked about. Legal Indigenous scholar Sarah Deer calls for presents a model of what this could look like for us. She argues for a tribal-centered analysis of knowledge, the development of research and research methods initiated by and for Native women that kind of can supplant the legal bureaucratic knowledge that rejects and ignores and erases Indigenous approaches to data and data analysis. And she makes the case that these types, you know, as an example, these types of approaches force us, right? There's guidance here for all of us because it kind of forces us to critically evaluate what we are doing when we are doing research, what counts as evidence, right? And what can collaboration look like, deep and meaningful collaboration with each other, with communities, in the doing of research and work that reflects the lives and concerns of communities, and how might rethinking how we approach our work help us also rethink fundamental questions about our disciplines and disciplinary boundaries, and even the meaning of authorship and beyond.
Yeah, for me, intersectionality cannot work unless it is decolonial. And I'm saying this as a Caribbean woman who was educated in the Caribbean, who has traveled to the US as a fully formed, well-made person who came to work here. All of my education up to my Ph.D. is in the Caribbean. And you come to this space, and this is a space that says that everything outside of this space is not fully formed and well-made, right? And so intersectionality, in order for me to find usefulness in the term intersectionality, I have to believe, I have to engage it has to be decolonial. Otherwise, then it does not apply to my fully formed self, right? Because if everyone in that archipelago of human otherness, including those who are formerly colonized, and in the Caribbean, we know there's still colonized countries, right? It cannot make sense unless it is decolonial for me. It just can't. And that's the short answer. For those who are wanting to say that intersectionality, for instance, is a legal framework or comes out of that critical legal framework, then it has to be decolonial because the law is the state. I mean, if you are critiquing the law, you're critiquing the state. You're fundamentally saying that this is wrong. These laws are bad. They're affecting these people who have always been seen and othered. And this is for people that I don't, if you're saying that intersectionality is just legal and that is the hill that you're going to die on, you're also dying on the hill that is decolonial. Period.
I'm going to move us into some questions that are in the Q&A, and do keep putting your questions in there. Let's look at, sorry, I lost track of which one I wanted to start with. There's some questions in here around who determines whether something is intersectional or not, and who gets to say they're doing intersectionality, which has been a debate sort of within the academy, right? And there's a piece of this too. There's some comments in the Q&A about, well, hasn't intersectionality been co-opted, right? And Black women's erasure within those lack of citational practices, which then also means there's a lack of attention to the labor, right? That goes into this theoretically, methodologically, but also in praxis and in pedagogy. And as Andrea, as you were describing what happens right within the academy. But if we're taking up a question of who gets to say what intersectionality is, what's our advice on that?
Okay, this is a really interesting question. And so this is sort of, me kind of thinking through this really kind of provocative question. My first thought is to kind of question the question, or the terms of the question, right? Sort of, this search for authorization there. I think maybe it is an indication of a different question, kind of attendant question that's about sort of how do we know when intersectionality is being done effectively, right? Because I think, for my mind at least, an intersectional perspective would say that this is not something that is externally sort of defined or, again, authorized, right? And in fact, we want to sort of move away from that sort of colonial, or at least potentially hegemonic logic, wherein, there's a kind of central locus of power that gets to say that is good, that is bad, or that is right, that does it right or that does it wrong, right? And that seems to be very much sort of complicit with, and I'm just thinking this through, but that seems to echo, I'll say, some of the logics of knowledge production that I think intersectional analysis wants to kind of leave behind, right? Or sort of expand. And so I think maybe another question that's related is sort of, how do we know when we're doing intersectional analysis? And I think that brings us back to the conversation that we've had, right? Are we constantly attempting to navigate multiple structures of difference and power? Are we constantly challenging ourselves to be attentive to, listen to, learn from, and center multiple voices, including the voices of race and gendered subjects, for example? That have we committed to, and are we continually committing to that integrated practice and analysis? For me, that maybe is a question that, for me, sort of calls me a little bit further in my thinking of what intersectionality can do, right? Because if it stops with you've done it or you've not done it, then it isn't intersectional analysis. Talking to students, I often talk about the language of ally, right? And the notion of ally as an identity. Well, how far does that get us? If it's a static fixed identity, then are you actively doing the work of alliance? Are you practicing the kind of solidarity that identity, that language of identity sort of purports to convey or confer? And I think there's a similar logic at play here. So that's just initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to add in on that, and I do want to hear from Christy and Andrea on that too. And Andrea, I'm going to tack this other piece on for you and just make it even more. But so there's some conversation in the Q&A too about, well, how do I support intersectionality? And I think pieces of that are also coming up in the Q&A about, well, how would a person who is cis, heteronormative, and white, can that person be intersectional, and can they participate in intersectionality? And I think pieces of this we've addressed, but let's return, right, and hone in on some of those responses. And I guess there is another piece of this here too, is can someone who is white be intersectional?
Okay, that is a
I
lot.
know, I touched a lot there.
So to the question about, there's so many. How
Right, deal with it how you want, Andrew.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I was gonna weigh in and say that how do we know who can do intersectionality? I think that's the gist of the entire thing. Who can do intersectionality?
So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how do you do intersectionality?
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, as Mecca put it so well, like this is an ongoing type of work that we're doing, right? And the ground, like, my son says that the floor is lava, like the bar is on the ground. For me is do no harm. That is what it is for me in terms of doing intersectionality work. And again, like my really good friend Tanya Hean says, like no movement, no one is innocent. So even in Black feminisms, is not an innocent, like there are things that happen all the time as we are learning, as we're growing, as we're moving forward. We learn not to say things that we took for granted before. We learn not to do things that we took for granted before. But I think if we are constantly doing that reflexive work and thinking through this in the vein of intersectionality was created and has this trajectory and this history and this activist history, which means to do no harm. That's basically the bar is on the floor. That's it. Do no harm. Do not, we're trying to, the folks that have been throughout history have been seen as non-human and non-persons. We are trying to say that these people are human too. These people deserve the things, right? And so intersectionality as a practice should be that we're always trying to be decent human beings. Again, that's the bar on the floor. And so if white people can be intersectional in terms of how they do work and practice, yes, but your intersectionality cannot be used against Black people. Your intersectionality cannot be used against queer people. Your intersectionality cannot be used against disabled people. If you engage in an intersectionality, which is, I do not want to harm folks in the way in which I'm doing this work, in terms of, I'm going to use intersectionality in the academy to say that we want this one Black feminist and we're going to work her to death because we just are doing it for show and performativity, then that is doing harm. That is not intersectionality. And so if we go from the very low bar of do no harm, then we can all do intersectional work.
Yeah, I would only add, going back to Andrea's earlier point about reflexivity and honesty, right? We have to be honest about our place in the world and our complicity in the systems that do harm. And I think we have to do the really hard work of recognizing the way in which white women have been and continue to be gatekeepers in the academy, right? Doing harm, getting a little bit of access and privilege and then slamming the door behind you and keep holding it shut. I also, these questions also again bring up Jennifer Nash's recent work, where she talks about the ways in which we often expect Black women to do the labor of gatekeeping intersectional purity, right? That Black women are often expected to tell us what intersectionality is and to tell us what's co-optation. And I hope we can, again, be reflexive and honest about those kinds of expectations. And she also makes a point that I think is worth mentioning potentially here, that we often think about intersectionality in really limited ways as kind of a critique or corrective of white feminism, as opposed to an incredibly, dynamic and rigorous paradigm in its own right. And I think both of those moves, right, expecting Black women to kind of patrol the boundaries of intersectional thinking and, limiting our understanding of intersectionality as a critique of white feminism, both of those are reductive and center whiteness. I think both of those moves are in the business of centering whiteness. And my hope is that we can again, to Andrea's point, be reflexive and honest about our tendencies to do that.
Great. Yeah. Okay, we have some comments just saying thank you for the conversation, and so I want to turn to another couple of these together. And so our Dean of Transform, Dean Catherine Stockton, is asking us to give an example of intersectionality that gets us to something powerful in or against an institution. And there's another question in here that's asking another kind of question about that too. Can institutions engage in intersectional work? I guess that's what our 3-year Mellon Foundation focuses about too. So putting Dean Stockton's and this other question about can institutions do intersectional work?
Well, I mean, it does seem to me that, yeah, absolutely. One of the many things that I think institutions offer us are spaces and resources, right? Tools for the kinds of, various kinds of sort of knowledge production, circulation of knowledge, and organizing, right? And so I think this is maybe, an example of intersectional work happening through the institution. And, I think probably all of us in our classrooms, right, imagine that as a site where we do, sort of radical, potent, powerful intersectional work. And I think, yeah, institutions, they do offer a lot in terms of, spaces and resources that, and gatherings of voices and storylines, right, that might not otherwise happen. So I think that there's a lot of sort of power and strength and possibility there.
Mm-hmm. We have and I like that, Dean Stockton was like, give us an example, right? Tell us an example of this. And that is so powerful. And one of our colleagues in Transform is just saying, it's really different when Hillary Clinton tweets about intersectionality, and it could be any number of people. It doesn't even need to be, right? Hillary Clinton. It's very different than when Audre Lorde was speaking about it as a revolutionary. And so this again goes back to this sort of co-optation perhaps of intersectionality, but perhaps we're at such a circulation of intersectionality now, and it has become this, right, intersectionality wars in both academia, popular culture, political culture, that I feel like what we're saying is we're keeping our eyes on what it's doing and what we are doing with intersectionality and what intersectionality requires of us, as well as the kinds of text and relationalities that we think are a part of really doing intersectionality, and that's what becomes key in our teaching too. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think going back to Dean Stockton's question about an example, like the example is how the university has turned intersectionality into diversity. Like it means the same thing across, like intersectionality is not diversity. That's not what it means. And we see this play out over and over again. We want to get all of these diverse bodies into these seats, into these universities. So we're gonna have them, we're gonna admit this quota of Black folks, or this quota of queer folks, or this quota of women. And what that means is that we are, by upping our diversity numbers, we are more intersectional. And that's not true, because I mean, but because this is where we're sitting right now in terms of the university space. I think that example is palatable to all of our, or not palatable is not the word, is close to home for all of us, because when you bring in all of these people, then what are you doing? Sometimes what we're doing, more often than not, is harmful, because we're not providing the resources that these students need. We're not providing the faculty to help the students. And what that means is that faculty end up with much more work. And so you're saying, when you equate diversity and intersectionality, and you are bringing all of these bodies, because they're all different, going back to what Audre Lorde, is saying, because they're all different, but you don't really respect that different. You don't really respect that culture. You're not interrogating the colonial system of the academy. It means that when you equate diversity to intersectionality, you are in fact doing harm, right? Mm-hmm. And so that would be my example.
Mm-hmm. Nice. There is I know we've gone a bit past our time, but there is a question in the Q&A, and whoever submitted this, because it's anonymous, I just want to encourage them, email me. I'm the only pillow at University of Utah, so please email me. The question is there a space in the approaches to intersectionality to consider non-human animals? And I think I would extend this question to say, it's about, we're back to the human, non-human, and intersectionality, right? Alongside a deep understanding of coloniality and decolonialism gets us right there to this question. Then it becomes not only about animals, right? It becomes about a relationality to space, to geographies, and to land. I love that question. Thank you for asking it. I would be happy to talk with that person by email and provide some readings and responses to that. So we're going to turn it over right now at this point to Dean Catherine Stockton, Dean of the Transform School at Utah.
I think I'm kind of left with one word, which is wow. And there were so many one-liners in this conversation that just kept building and building and building. I cannot picture that there's anybody on here who wants you to stop, because as you keep going, then a next generative path happens and next. So I'm going to take those one-liners, which I wrote down. They go about 100 feet deep, each of them. And the beauty of that is we can keep coming back to this recording to hear you, to think with you, to think by your side. It's really just my happy task to thank you and to say you are very much of our heart now. This is our inaugural event. This is beginning a 3-year building of a collective that we hope is not just going to be a 3-year process, but is going to be a process, yes, for this institution. So thank you, Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Baldwin, as coming from afar to visit us. And of course, Dr. Glass, who's close at hand. And I just do have to say, of course, I love the emphasis on narrative. So I cannot wait to be immersed in the book. And of course, you know, I was at the book launch for Dr. Baldwin, which was its own phenomenal conversation and just an incredible segue into this one. So I want to say that, of course, what we are going to be building institutionally, structurally, but interpersonally and relationally is a transformative intersectional collective. We are grateful to the Mellon Foundation for giving us that grant money. And I just want to give a little shout out, in case they're here, to also our fellow PIs, our principal investigators at the other 5 and possibly 6 universities. I want to name them because as soon as I name them, you will recognize them as amazing souls whose work you have learned from, as have I. Gayatri Gopinath at NYU, Tiffany King at University of Virginia, Elizabeth West at Georgia State, Karen Thompson at University of Southern California, and I believe also soon joining us, Cynthia Oliver at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. So I could not be more excited about this beginning. And again, with such humility, we thank you for bringing just this incredible wisdom to our door, to our screen. And I think we will feel very sewn to the bone with you in these conversations. And we will be reading you. Trust me, we are going to be reading your books. Those are going to be on our lists. And indeed, we might have to ask you back to converse a little more with you.
Yes.
So, thank you, panelists. Thank you, Dr. Pillow, for moderating in such a beautiful way. Of course, thank you, Estela Hernandez, for all the work, and Kilo Zamora for being in the chat and making everything go so smoothly. It's been a beautiful afternoon. And I actually am going to hazard some hope for something that we can collectively do together. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Take care, everybody.